Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everyone, to be there. I think that even if I'm sitting all by myself in front of my computer, I can feel the interest and the passion for the topic of theory building. So I'm very grateful that you are there. I will say tonight, because even though I am a professor at HEC Montreal, I am currently in Singapore. This explains the flowery shirt. So it is 9 o'clock at night, and I'm still a bit on jet lag. So if the presentation is boring, it's not my fault, it's just jet lag. Okay, so I was invited to talk about theory building, and especially to have a talk on demystifying theory building in management research. I have a subtitle for this presentation, and it is, as David mentioned, theory building is neither an art nor a science, it is a craft. And I will explain as we go along why I think that this title is very important, as it conveys much of my beliefs about theory building. First things first, when I teach graduate classes, I always have one first question for every book and every article that we read. And this first question is, who is that person? And I find that it is very important to know who is the author of a book and who is a presenter, in order to have a sense of what can be the assumptions of that person, even if it means that we may have some biases by listening to the person. But I think that a philosopher might approach theory building in a different fashion from a professor in a business school. I think it's also important to understand why the person has written a book or an article, and what was their motivation and what was their objective. So I will tell you very rapidly a bit about who the person in front of you is. I am first a management of information systems researcher. I've been trained in a business school in management information systems, and ever since my doctorate studies decades ago, I've been interested in the management of the use of information technologies in organizations. And for the past 20 years, I've been the holder of the chair of strategic management of information systems at HEC Montreal. So information system researcher, I would call myself a theory building artisan, not a theory building expert, not a theory building scientist, but really an artisan. I am also SC, who was a few years ago in charge of a theory and review department in the MI's quarterly for 6 years. And for the past 10 years, I've been teaching a theory building seminar in the PhD program at HEC. So I have firsthand experience in developing theories myself for my own research. I have also read a lot of theory manuscripts. One day I was counting, and I think that I have read 100,000 pages of manuscripts and reviews and associate editors' reports during those 6 years. So I've read a lot about theory. And I've been teaching a theory building seminar for 10 years at HEC. Every year I have between 15 and 20 students. They have to write a theory paper, and they have to submit 3 versions of their paper, and I read all of them. Last week, I was grading the papers and I have Grammarly, the software Grammarly on my computer. And in the report of my activity, the software told me that I had read 1 million words during the week. So I've read a lot about of papers on theory building or of theory building. And here I come to the motivation for thinking about what theory building is. And over the years in my own work and in evaluating the work of other people, I saw how mysterious theory was and how mysterious theory building was. And I think that it doesn't serve us as researchers to have that perspective that only the great can develop theories. My very strong belief is that every human being is a theory developer. We have theories about everything. The baby has a theory about what makes her father come during the night, see what's wrong. The father has a theory about what can make a baby stop crying. We have theories about everything. What makes a difference between the theory of the layperson and the theory of the researcher is more the level of abstraction of the theory, certain codes to present and share the theory. And this is what we are striving to do. Now, for those who are interested, the essence of the talk has been published in the Journal of Information Technology in the article entitled "Theory Building is Neither an Art nor a Science, it is a Craft." So if you're interested, I think that there are some details that I cannot present in a 1-hour presentation and that you can find in that article. Now, I think that researchers very often, I don't say all researchers, but very often researchers have a romantic view of theory. We see theory as a complete, detailed, flawless, deep and exhaustive explanation of a phenomenon. Weick used the sentence, a theory that sweeps away all others. We think that for something to be a theory, it has to be that, a grand theory. And having that view of theory, I think, as I mentioned earlier, has negative effects. Authors do not dare to develop theories, and reviewers and editors do not dare to accept theory papers because only the great can develop theories. The alternative view of theory that I propose, I borrowed from Weick again. And Weick talks about products of the theorizing process that seldom emerge as full-blown theories, which means that most of what passes for theory in organizational studies consists of approximations and represents interim struggles in which people intentionally inch towards stronger theory. And it is this view that that supports my work when I develop theory. Because if I have the romantic view of coming up with something that will sweep away the mind, or that will just put aside all the existing theories, I will not dare developing any model. So I keep in mind that what we do are approximations of a theory that we wish to develop. When I talk about theory, I think that it's very important that I define the term. Theory is an explanation of a phenomenon. Now, the explanation of a phenomenon, any human being has developed in their life, explanations of phenomena. So for a theory in the scientific world to be true theory. The explanation has to be expressed by statements of relationships among concepts. It can be via propositions, but it can be also as a running theoretical explanation. And the explanation is bounded, and this is very, very important. The explanation is bounded by assumptions, contextual assumptions and conceptual assumptions. And this is important in order to be able to state the extent of the domain to which our theory applies. Now, there's also a romantic view of theory building, and one of them is theory building as an art. And this view, I think, is the one that a junior researcher very often has, and it is the theorist has inspiration sparks, the theory emerges during trance-like periods of writing, and once the theory is written, it should not be modified. So it is, you're inspired. You are Archimedes, who sits in his bath and he says, Eureka, or you are another great researcher who found something. I remember the first time I taught my theory building course, I was telling students that theory building takes time and takes effort, and you don't develop a theory, not even within a term at the university. And one student raised his hand and he gave me the name of a great researcher. I think it was in the author of the groupthink theory. And he said, well, this author developed his theory in 2 hours, sitting at a cafe table. Well, this person did it. I can't. And I hope that you can, but most researchers cannot do it. The other romantic view is of theory building as a science. And here I have a program flowchart, which represents, for example, for deductive theory building, well, I find quite a number of papers, of articles on the process of theory building that I have my students read. And very often we have the impression that it is an algorithm. You review the literature, you find a gap, or you problematize the literature, you develop the theory, identify the constructs, the laws of interaction, the boundaries, and then you develop your propositions. So it seems as something very, I say scientific, maybe it's more like a recipe, but it appears to be easy to develop and straightforward. Even in inductive theory building, when you read about inductive theory building, you have the review of the literature at the same time as you do your field work, maybe. But most of the time, you have to know your literature, find a gap, or problematize the literature, collect the data, analyze the data, and write up the theory. And my experience over the years is that it is not so. My experience is that theory building is a messy process, just as the cute Mr. Messy that we have all read, either ourselves or to our children. And to me, this is the process of theory building. Now, it is a less romantic view than the theory building as an art or as a science. It is theory building as a craft, and a craft calls for exerting care and ingenuity, but especially requires patience and perseverance. I came up over the years thinking about how I interact with authors of theory papers as a senior editor or as a teacher in my theory building course, or my own experience of developing theory. I have the impression that, and here I simplify the process, but it is more of a spiral than a straightforward activity. Now, this spiral is read as follows. We have activities. For example, we have read, research, respite, review, renounce, revise. And we have, at each spire, we have reflect and write, reflect and write, reflect and write. So those activities, as you see, they come often in the whole process of theory building. And from the activities emerge what I call ions of theory construction. And several years ago, I wrote an editorial for the MI's Quarterly about the ions of theory construction. And I used the term ion to refer to small particles that have to be there for some component to exist. But it is not the sole presence of the ions that will make that the component will be of quality or not. It is how the chemist assembles them. And to me, a theory is similar. There are those ions, what I call the ions of theory construction. And it is not just the fact that they are there that makes the theory good, but it is how we assemble them. However, I think that identifying those ions and paying attention to them can be quite useful for the theory builder. And this is what I want to share with you today. So let's look at the first activity, which is read. And I think that as researchers in management, reading and talking, reading, writing, and talking are activities that we do a lot. Here, I want to represent the first spire and the first time that the researcher reads. And it doesn't mean that I start on day one and I start reading. Maybe I have read for 10 years the literature on a topic. And then I feel that the moment comes that I am ready to develop my theory. But in my course, the PhD students arrive and they have some topic that they would like to, on which they would like to develop a theory. And they have to start sometimes their reading to be able to develop their theory. And this first spire of reading should lead to the ion of erudition. And in my view, erudition is very important in the domain of theory building. And by erudition, we refer to the breadth and depth of one's understanding of a particular topic, generally acquired by study, research, and so on. Erudition means that the author has to cover extant literature, a large domain of literature, geographical and epistemological. If you are an interpretive researcher, it can be very interesting to read papers from more positivist authors because there might be interesting things that they have to say, and the reverse is also true. And sometimes we have a tendency of covering the literature from, for example, North America or Europe. I think that it's also important to develop erudition, to have a broad coverage of literature. And in this reading should be to understand and internalize the literature. It requires hard thinking more than hard digging and hard finding new articles. And this spire that I present only once, in reality, might be many small iterations between the reading the literature to try to understand it and reflect and write. And reflect and write, I put them after reading, but all those activities, they obviously come at the same time, or they should come at the same time. If any of you are PhD students, I would warn you that it is very risky to say, I will read those articles, I will take notes, and then I will write my literature review for the thesis. I think that as soon as we start reading a paper, we have to start writing about it. Even if it is a little summary. When I read papers within a domain, I develop tables. I start developing tables. I have huge Excel spreadsheets where I have the authors and the title, and then the concepts, the findings, and so on and so forth. And they don't make sense when I start reading a literature. But you know, I am a craftsperson, so I do the work, and I read and I write down what I have read, and I think about it, and I think about what is similar between this article and the other article, and so on and so forth. And from this reflect and write comes an ion, which is very important. All the ions are very important, but the ion of cohesion has to be taken care of. And cohesion means how congruent are the components of the theory that I'm developing. At the beginning, the cohesion will be, well, is my understanding of a phenomenon the same when I read this author as when I read this other author? But as we will see as we go along, cohesion will take different forms. And if in my reading, I see, for example, that people use the same term, but they refer to different concepts, or they have something different in mind, well, I will see a lack of cohesion in the literature, and that may spark an idea for theory development. And I will give you an example a bit later. So then in the second spire, I continue reading, but I have acquired some understanding of the basics of the literature in the domain. And it will not be after 3 or 4 months of reading that it will become an erudite in the domain. But I continue using the name of that ion to say, well, now we know about that literature. Second reading that we do of the literature is for finding the motivation. And here, motivation, and here I refer to the Sandberg and Alveson's article in the Academy. Oh, this one was in organization, but they wrote a similar one in Academy of Management. And it is about how researchers construct their research questions. And they say that gap spotting is the favored way of motivating a paper. And they say, well, there are 3 types of gap spotting: confusion spotting, when evidence from extant research is contradictory. And I was talking about cohesion earlier. Well, when I read the literature and I realize that, well, there's confusion, there's a lack of cohesion, then it can help me identify a gap in the literature, and it can become my motivation to develop a theory to make things clearer. Another type of gap is neglect spotting, when a phenomenon is deemed an overlooked area or another research topic. This is interesting, but as you know, it is very risky, because it can very well be because a topic is not interesting, that it has not been researched. So neglect spotting maybe should not be the preferred way of identifying your motivation. And application spotting, when the literature needs to be extended or complemented, or sometimes it is because a current theory will explain with something within a contextual boundary, but outside that boundary, it hasn't been explained. And then we have a gap, and we can try to fill that gap with the theory that we will be developing. However, Sandberg and Alvesen and other researchers say that gap spotting is not the only way of motivating, and they suggest problematization as another way. And problematization is defined a bit differently by different authors. For example, Alvesen and Sandberg say that problematization is to challenge assumptions in extent theory. Wetton is a bit softer when he talks about that, and he talks about relaxing assumptions, but it's exactly the same thing as challenging the assumptions. And Davis in 1971 was telling us that we can look at a field, at the literature, by saying, well, what seems to be X is in reality non-X. And I will give you an example of an approach of problematization with a colleague. I'm working on a theory building paper where we observed contradictions in the work of some teams. And all the literature on that domain of work, it's software development teams, and all the literature that talked about the contradictions of those software development teams, they assume implicitly that there were contradictions because the teams were faced with demands from different sources that were different in terms of content. And in the work that we were doing, it was an inductive theory building piece. And in the work that we were doing, we observed that in the teams that we studied, the competing demands that came to our teams were not due to the content of the demands that were contradictory, but their temporality. It was not, there was no contradiction about what had to be done. There were contradictions about when something had to be done. So we took a problematization approach, and we said we relax the assumption of contradictory demands as being different in terms of content, and we propose the alternate assumption of contradictory demands being different in terms of time. We are not reinventing the wheel, but we think that we have a new and different approach and an interesting way of motivating our work. Now, then we have to reflect and write, because I cannot just read the literature and find a gap or find the assumption that can be challenged will not jump to my eyes. I have to think about the literature that I've read. I have to write about my understanding of that literature so that this gap or this assumption that I can challenge or relax can emerge. Once again, we have to focus on cohesion. Does it make sense? I have that idea that this new assumption that I want to propose makes sense. Now, do I have it elsewhere in the literature? Does it make sense if I do inductive theory building? Do I have it in my data so that it is consistent and coherent? So, and this is, we're just at the motivation part now, don't forget. Then the third spire is, again, read. And this time, we are refining our work. And the ion of definition is ready to emerge. And when I talk about definition, I talk about the phenomenon of interest. When I write a manuscript that proposes a theory about something, the something has to be defined. It has to be clear to the reader. The theory boundary, what will be, and this will change a lot. Be sure of that. And this is why cohesion is so important during the whole spiral process of theory building, because I can start by saying, okay, my boundary, let's start, we have conceptual assumptions and contextual assumptions. The conceptual assumptions, Wetton calls them conceptual assumptions. He said they are second order assumptions. The implicit whys underlying an explicit answer to our why question. And I will simplify that. The conceptual assumptions are the fundamental beliefs of the researchers on which the explanation or the theory is anchored. Very often when we develop a theory, we will develop a theory within a perspective. And this perspective has conceptual assumptions. For instance, I'm sure that many of you will develop a theory in the neo-institutional theory perspective. Well, in the neo-institutional perspective theory, theory, a very important assumption is legitimacy. And this assumption will undergird all the analyses that I will make if I develop a theory within that perspective. Similarly, for example, in the article, the paper that I was talking earlier, we adopt entrainment theory. And entrainment theory is a theory related to the role of time. And there is an assumption that the actors have agency in the decision of whether they will entrain to another agent or another actor or not. And this agency assumption is very important in our explanation, and we have to find it, we have to identify it, but also we have to write it in the paper. There are also the contextual assumptions. They determine the conditions that circumscribe the explanation that we propose. That is, when does it work? Where does it work? For whom? Is it an individual level theory that I propose? Or is it an organizational level theory? Is it multi-level? It is very, very important to define those elements. The constructs. And here again, don't forget my Mr. Messy. We come up with constructs at the beginning of our theory building, constructs that exist, and then I can say, there is one thing missing in the explanation, and I will propose a new construct. But even the constructs that exist, we have to be careful about the definitions. And what we observe is that very often, and every year, my students in the theory building course, they come to me and they say, Madame Rivard, I am studying that field, which is very well researched in my domain. It can be OB or strategy. And there's a concept, there's a construct that is in many articles. And I look for definitions, and very often the concept or the construct are not defined, or if they are defined, the different articles don't define them in the same way. And this is very risky in research. If you don't have the same definition, you're not talking about the same thing. So the results are very difficult to compare. And sometimes you find that there are contradictory results in research, and it is because the constructs are not defined in the same way. So there exist very good sources, and I recommend them very warmly, about construct definition. For example, Walker says a good conceptual definition is a concise, clear verbal expression of a unique concept. Well, didn't invent anything, but in his article, he has rules, and they're very, very interesting. And In my course, I asked my students to apply those rules to their construct definitions. And very rapidly, we realized that sometimes we fail when we define our construct. One rule, for example, is that all definitions should follow the rule of replacement. It is a very simple rule, but very often it doesn't work. And it just means, well, if I have a construct, for example, satisfaction, which is defined as the way to which people are happy. And if for rule 1 to apply, I have to be able to replace satisfaction by its definition in a sentence. And if I say people's satisfaction in a sentence, I cannot replace satisfaction by people the way people are happy with something. So we have to be very careful. And you will say, oh my gosh, isn't she picky? Yes, I am picky in terms of definitions. And for those who are PhD students, doctoral students, your committee will be picky. And for all of us, our reviewers and our editors will be picky. So construct definition is very, very important. Walker also tells us definitions should include only unambiguous and clear terms, which we very often call primitives, which means that the terms that are in a conceptual definition, for it to be clear, should not need to be defined themselves. So they have to be very, very simple words that people will understand no matter the field where they are. Another very important rule is that definitions of a construct should not include hypotheses about the construct. If you say, for example, that satisfaction is the way people are happy about a service they receive because the salesperson was good, it's not a good conceptual definition of the construct, because we have an hypothesis. We have the salesperson being nice will increase the client satisfaction. So now we have a problem with our construct definition. Sotheby's wrote an editorial about the clarity of constructs, and he mentions that conceptual definition ought to capture the essential properties and characteristics of the construct, avoid tautology and circularity, so the not include the hypothesis about the construct, and be parsimonious. So those are very interesting and very useful sources for ensuring that your constructs are well defined. It is also important to define the type of theory that we want to build. Do I want to build a variance theory? Do I want to build a process theory? And those two types of theories, and there are others, but they are the two main types of theories that we see in management. And they have very different assumptions. And here I very strongly suggest the Van de Ven and Poole article in Organization Studies on alternative approaches for studying organizational change. And even if your theory is not about organizational change, this source is very, very important, because they detail the differences between a variance approach and a process approach. And it is so important because they imply very different ways of thinking about the phenomenon, of thinking about the concept, of thinking about causality, about the role of time. So it has to be clear in our mind which type of theory I want to develop. Now, this does not mean that the type of theory that you build will not change over time during the process of theory development, because as we advance, we understand the phenomenon better, and we try our explanations. And sometimes what we thought could receive a good variance explanation would be better explained with a process explanation. So this is very important to keep in mind that the nature of our theory can vary. And as we know, there are hybrid types of theory. For example, Burton-Jones and colleagues in the European Journal of Information Systems talked about system type theory, which is interesting as well. Okay, so this read, which can take a long time and require a lot of reflect and write, should help us come up with all those elements of definition that are very important. And again, thinking and writing and reading what we wrote should be done in order for those ions to emerge, but also to check for cohesion. Does it make sense? Okay, I say I am, and that I have to do with my students. Okay, you tell me that you're developing a variance theory. Now, read the definition of your constructs. They are not definitions that fit in a variance type of theory, because in a variance type of theory, the constructs should be defined in such a way that they can vary, that their value can vary. So you have to be careful of that. So those elements, those ions are very, very important. Okay, so we have the first three spires with read, reflect, and write. Now, we will do research. And what do I mean by research? It is not go and try to test our theory. And here I'm more either in a deductive theory building process or in the inductive theory building process, where the reading that I have done, that the analysis that I have done was very often of the data that I have collected. So the research I have here doesn't correspond to data collection. It corresponds to here I have an example. It's another very precious source for me. It's a Jacquard and Jacobi book on theory construction, a model building skills, a practical guide for the social scientists. And it is a very practical guide about theory building. And they propose 26 heuristics that we can use to, and I call them research because they make me think about my theory, that we can use to refine our thinking, to advance our thinking, to develop our thinking, to propose ideas of what could be those relationships among the constructs. Because let's not forget that a theory is an explanation of a phenomenon. We have concepts and relationships among those concepts. So, for example, they say use role-playing. You want to explain consumer satisfaction in a sales encounter, use role-playing. When am I satisfied? When am I not satisfied? What would happen if? Talk to real people, talk to consumers, observe, go to a shop, or go, if it is on electronic commerce, go on a website and see. For example, I had a student who was developing a theory on chatbots. And she had that literature, and she had read the literature. And I said, well, have you tried chatbots on the web? She said, no. As if trying chatbots was not something that was scientific enough. And I said, well, go on 5, 6 websites and just try their chatbots and see how you react with them. They say, for example, if you have a variance theory, don't only consider antecedents and consequences, but consider moderators, mediators, moderated mediation, mediated moderation, and so on and so forth. Reframe the problem in terms of the opposite. Very often, you can ask, okay, I say that A leads to B. What if it was the opposite? What if it was B that led to it? And right away, you cannot shy away from that sentence and say, oh, no, 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 it cannot happen. No, because sometimes you will find original explanations, just thinking differently. If you develop a process theory, you can try to think about your theory more in terms of variance. If you develop a variance theory, try to think about it more in terms of process, not because you have to change it, it's because it will uh, foster your imagination, which is the next I want to talk about. One heuristic that I find very useful is consider abstractions or specific instances. Most of my theory building is inductive theory building. So I start with very, very concrete elements, and my explanations are very concrete. And I apply that heuristic. I try to abstract, go one level higher, at least one level higher of abstraction, to have something which is stronger and richer in terms of an explanation. Conduct thought experiments, that is, go through your theory and check whether it works or not just by going through it. Okay, so that is the research activity, and it will lead to the ion of imagination. That is the ability to come up with new concepts, ideas, and explanations, because you don't want your theory to be the same as the XYZ theory. You want something to be new. You want your explanation to be interesting and new. And again, read, then I put read there. Read means go back to your literature. Yes, once the literature review is finished, it is not finished. We have to go back to our literature and see, oh, the ideas that I had, did someone had it before me and I have not seen it when I was doing my literature review? Or if you're doing inductive theory building, well, what I have in mind, well, did I have that in my data or not? So this is very important. And again, another ion that we have to be very careful of is our cohesion ion. The next spire is, and I think that it's, if not my favorite, it's maybe the most important activity, and it is respite. And yes, respite as rest. And that we don't do enough when we build theory. We focus on the theory that we want to build, and we want it to work, and we want to develop an explanation. And we forget that our brain can work on its own, even when we don't force it. And for example, the literature talks about combinatory play, which is the cognitive manipulation of ideas, feelings that happen when we're not focusing on something. And for example, we have here the example of Einstein, who in his struggles with extremely complicated mathematics that led to the general theory of relativity, Einstein often tuned for inspiration to the simple beauty of music and played the violin. So playing the violin for him was a way of letting his mind go and letting his mind working on its own on the theory. And personally, I do it. I don't play the violin, but I run. And when I have problems with an explanation that doesn't emerge nicely, and I try to find the explanation doesn't work, I stop trying to develop the explanation and I go for a run. And I let my mind work on its own, and I just think about running and how nice it is. And not all the time, but very often there are ideas that emerge. If you're not a runner, you can just vacuum your apartment, and I think that it works, or wash the dishes. I think it works pretty well as well. But here in respite, my recommendation, if I may say so, is let your brain work on the theory on its own. You put all those ideas in your brain, and then they're ingrained in your brain, and it will work on its own. And some explanation will emerge. How and why does the phenomenon occur? What are the mechanisms? What are the processes? What are the causes? This is the heart of the theory that we, with imagination, the research that leads to imagination and the respite that help explanation emerge, this is the heart of our theory. And again, we have to read, reflect, and write, because we have to make sure that there is cohesion in what we're doing. The sixth and last spire has, so when we arrive at that spire, and as I said earlier, maybe it's a bit messier than the nice spiral that we have, but the last one, I have 3 activities: review, renounce, and revise. In reviewing, what I do when I read my manuscript many times, I take the position of a reviewer. I don't take the position of the author, because I love the theory that I'm developing. And finding flaws in the theory that I'm developing would be like finding flaws in my children, and I don't want that. So I put myself in the shoes, on the seat of a reviewer, and I read that piece as an object that I have to assess. And I try to find weaknesses and things that don't work well. This is a very important activity. Another one is renounce. And this activity is maybe the hardest. It means that sometimes you realize that there is a piece of your theory that you liked so much, that you worked so much to develop, to come up with. Sometimes it can be a 10-page literature review that is based on weeks of reading. And you realize that it doesn't bring anything to the literature, to your theory. It was very important in developing your erudition, your understanding, but you can summarize it in a paragraph, and that's enough. This is very difficult to do, or an explanation that you like and it doesn't work. Well, renouncing is a must when we develop theory. And revise, that is, sometimes it is starting over. Yes, sometimes it is almost starting from scratch. I didn't take the right angle. I didn't take, for example, the paper I was talking about earlier. Well, we rewrote it many times. And at one point, we had used sociomateriality to take into account the role of time. And we had the full manuscript, and we received a revise and resubmit, because the review team didn't like our use of sociomateriality. And we had to renounce sociomateriality and revise the paper. We analyze the data. But those are the rules of the game. And this leads to the iron of contribution. This is where we can have our contribution emerge. And once again, read, reflect, and write for cohesion. Because after all those iterations, it is sure that the boundary of the theory will have changed. Sometimes you will have new constructs that you included and that you have not defined. You had a variance theory, now it's a process. You had a multi-level theory, now it is a single level theory, or the opposite. So cohesion. Recently I was reading again the same manuscript, and I realized that in the same sentence, not the same page, sorry, we use 3 different words to refer to the same construct, 3 synonyms. And there's a rule of the theorist. And the rule is the synonym is the enemy of the theorist. When I have a word for a construct, I cannot use synonyms. Yes, the writing is more elegant when we use synonyms, but we are not doing elegance here. We are doing theory building. So this is a very important element. So the overall outcome of this process is this spiral, the approximation of one's theory. But very often the theory that is in our vision is a bit more complex. Well, we can do two things. The first one is to say, I will continue iterating until I reach that beautiful 3 spirals theory. Or we can say, okay, one step at a time. Now I have a product of theorizing this approximation. I will try to have it published. And then I can continue my thinking and come with another approximation of another component. And when you read, there is an excellent book that I'm sure you know, The Great Minds of Management, which is chapters written by great theorists. For example, Mintzberg, Williamson, and so on and so forth. And when you read those authors, when they talk about the process of theory building, and one that I found striking, Williamson, when he talks about the theory, transaction cost theory, first time he thought about the question was he was in high school, and he developed the theory much, much later. So I think that we have to take our approximations as actual components, actual products, and then have long-term vision of the beautiful, complete theory that we want to develop. So this is all for my speech. I think that I respected the time. I will welcome your questions. I will be pleased to see your questions.